Good morning and welcome to this IEEP UK webinar on the UK FRC, the forest risk commodities, where we ask the question, what's next for deforestation regulation in the UK? My name is Malini Mehra and I'm chair of IEEP UK and delighted to be moderating this session where we'll be joined by leading experts from the UK Parliament, civil society, business, and our very own IEP offices here in the UK and in Brussels. So thank you very much for joining us for a subject that we are examining closely at IEP UK. This is as part of our ongoing study of divergence, or not, as the case may be, of environmental policies between the UK and Europe, with specific reference to the European Union since Brexit. So today we will hear from Pippa Heylings MP, the Liberal Democrat Net Zero and Energy Security spokesperson and co-chair of the APPG on global deforestation. We will also hear from Nicola Brennan, deforestation and conversion-free supply chain specialist at WWF-UK, from Joe James, sustainability manager, forest risk commodities at Sainsbury's, our very own Ed Worsdell, research officer at IEP UK, and Nora Hiller, senior policy analyst, global challenges and SDGs at IEP AISBL, which is our office in Brussels. I'm going to introduce each of them more fully shortly in turn. But firstly, to start with the context for today's session and our focus. The UK's Environment Act, of course, of 2021 prohibits the use of forest risk commodities in the UK that have been produced in a manner that does not comply with local land use laws. However, this ban will require secondary legislation to determine its scope, due diligence, reporting requirements, and implementation timeline. And this legislation has still not been introduced. So in this webinar, we take a closer look at the need for UK FRC regulations and their potential scope, exploring the case for alignment with the EUDR, which we'll be hearing more about shortly. With the recent back and forth on delays and simplification of the EUDR, of course, this webinar comes at a very important moment for action on deforestation in supply chains across both the UK and Europe. So we will start, however, with a keynote address by Pippa Heylings, a Member of Parliament, the Liberal Democrat Net Zero and Energy Security spokesperson and co-chair of the APPG on global deforestation. Just checking if Pippa is in and ready to go.
I'm here and ready to go. Thank you so much, Malini.
Great to see you on the screen, Pippa. And of course, Pippa is no stranger to any of us. She's shown great interest in IEP's work, for which we are very grateful. And she brings an enviable and supremely appropriate professional background for today's discussion. Pippa has lived and worked in climate-affected developing countries for most of her professional life, with 8 years in East Africa and 15 years in South and Central America and the Caribbean. She has dedicated her career to international climate change and social and environmental policy dialogue, working with the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, IPBES, governments, and a wide range of social and environmental charities and community organizations. For many years, she was also the CEO of a Latin American NGO specializing in the transformation of social and environmental conflict, working alongside Global South leaders, negotiating for climate and environmental justice in the UN negotiations and in national legislation. Pippa has previously worked as the Lib Dem spokesperson on the LGA National Climate Change Task Force, representing local government networks worldwide at COP26, and has been the deputy chair on the Environment, Economy, Housing and Transport Board. She's now the Lib Dem Member of Parliament for South Cambridgeshire, and as I mentioned earlier, the Lib Dem spokesperson for Energy Security and Net Zero and member of the Environmental Audit Select Committee. Pippa, we're delighted to have you today to kick off the session, and the floor is yours. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Martin, and also to IEP for this really, really timely and critical discussion and about, what's next for forest risk commodities regulation. And it's just such a pleasure for me to now be in this place, which is in the House of Commons, and working cross-party through the all-party parliamentary group on deforestation, but also in my role as the Liberal Democrat spokesperson for energy security and net zero, and basically for our climate and nature policy, which we just passed this last conference in September. So we know that the UK made an important commitment through the Environment Act 2021 to eliminate illegal deforestation from UK supply chains. And that was celebrated. That was very, very good news. But 4 years on, we still don't have the secondary regulation to put this into, to apply this, to implement it with clarity that's needed across the supply chains on which commodities are covered by this, how due diligence will work, and what sanctions will apply. So it's a promise that's been made, but really critically, it's not yet being delivered. And that delay has real world consequences, some of which, as you've said, in my professional career, I have seen, and we've been waiting for UK's leadership together with the EU on this. So Global Witness has estimated that the UK's current lack of regulation has contributed to deforestation, which could be equivalent to the size of Liverpool. And if we think about COP30 coming up, we're going to be in the heart of the Brazilian Amazon. You know, this matters, this size, this scale matters. And most of that UK deforestation footprint is linked to cattle products imported from Brazil. So again, this ahead of COP30, this is crucial. And we're seeing, we've just had the latest, first climate tipping point report, which came out last week, which said that we've already, as we're hurtling towards a 2-degree world, we've seen the first tipping point in terms of warm water coral reefs. But in that 2-degree world, we're also looking at the tipping point in terms of Amazon dieback, which would be absolutely catastrophic for nature and those forests and the peoples that are dependent on. But as we know, they are the lungs of the world. So that would mean the Brazilian Amazon, which we know is already about to happen, switching from being this giant sponge which absorbs those carbon emissions to then being a source of carbon emissions. So a complete tipping point and switch where that will then contribute to global warming because of deforestation and degradation of that land which is holding all of that carbon there. So, you know, it's both environmental issue, but it's also a human rights issue. And indigenous and local communities with whom I've worked with for many, many years in the Amazon, they bear the brunt of this deforestation, and they bear the brunt of human rights violations in terms of the number of assassinations of those community leaders that are stepping up to protect what should be the rights of their self-determination across their lands, the customary lands, but also in terms of what supposedly is policy in terms of protecting those lands. So protecting forests means protecting people too. So what do we need to happen with the UK forest risk commodity regulation? Well, the Environmental Audit Committee, of which I have been a member for the last year, I have to announce that I have stepped down so I can focus fully on my spokes role, and because it's busy and we want to have the most impact. But whilst I was member of that Environmental Audit Committee, we did come out saying that the legislation has to be expanded beyond illegal deforestation, because that's what it's saying at the moment. We just passed, as I said, our new climate policy at Liberal Democrat conference, and our climate policy says that we should be moving towards the equivalent of EUDR, so the EU's deforestation regulation, which means that companies which are importing commodities which are associated with forest loss, and we know that those are such as palm oil or soya, they would be sanctioned. So they would not be allowed if they are seen to be causing both forest loss and, importantly, the EUDR makes it, and degradation. So it's not just loss, but also degradation. And we need to be coming into line. That's our Lib Dem policy. The Environmental Audit Committee has also pushed for us to go beyond, as cross-party, to go beyond just that illegal definition. And also the previous government had looked at proposals for large exemptions. So in the UK, what the proposal was as we come into this secondary regulation was that companies with turnover under £50 million or importing under 500 tonnes would be exempt from this. And again, we think that's not right, because this would exclude many high impact businesses. So the issues about going beyond illegal is, in some countries, what is considered legal would also actually lead to a lot of forest loss, and we are the driver of that. Our consumption patterns are the driver of that forest loss and degradation. So it's not enough just to look at what's illegal. It's also about changing that consumption and production pattern. Also, we don't agree with what has been proposed that there should be certain exemptions, because we have to look at impact as well as size and scale of the business itself. So what we would say is we need to publish the secondary legislation without further delay, widen the scope to include all deforestation and degradation, lower or remove any of those exemptions that undermine impact, and align with the EU deforestation regulation to avoid a two-tier market where goods that are banned in the EU simply get rerouted through the UK. One of my roles that I had before coming an MP was working together with FSC, Forest Stewardship Certification. And what they were looking at is how do they support companies that are looking at becoming compliant with the EUDR. And we know that this is about both those high environmental standards to reduce that forest loss. It's about the making this economic viable for companies, and also for those human rights and those social impacts across the supply chains to enable them to be able to comply with the EUDR. And when we were looking at that, we were looking at the dangers of companies rerouting away from the EU. And if the UK becomes part of that rerouting, we undermine everything that we're trying to work towards. So thanks very much for this opportunity. It's absolutely timely and critical now. Hope to meet many of you in Berlin at COP30, and thank you so much for this opportunity. I look forward to hearing from others.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Pippa. We understand that you can't stay for a Q&A, but we're very grateful for the clarity of your very substantive presentation, your 4-point proposals. So those have been well noted. And we will be in touch with you with a reprise of today's conversation here in this webinar. So this definitely is the start of a conversation which will take place, including at COP30. So hope to see you then very shortly. But thank you once again.
And can I just say that the reason why I'm rushing off is I've actually just been given a question. So you get questions in the ballot in the chamber in the House of Commons, and that is for the Foreign Office. And I'm going to be asking a question particularly about our contribution to the Tropical Forest Forever initiative. So I'm asking for confirmation that we will be committing to that and contributing to it, which is why I'm rushing off now to go into the chamber. Sorry about that.
That's great to hear. Thank you very much. Again, very relevant to today's conversation. Have a good day, Pippa. Thank you again. And I'm now going to invite my colleague, Ed Worsdell, please. We're going to be having 2 presentations laying out the UK FRC regulations and also the EUDR, the European Union's deforestation regulation. So first off, we have Ed, who's going to provide a presentation on the UK FRC. And if I can introduce my colleague, Ed. Ed is a researcher at IEEP UK. His background is in environmental political economy and policy analysis. His academic and professional work to date has focused on food systems and supply chains. Before joining IEEP UK, Ed worked at the Environmental Justice Foundation, where he conducted desk and field-based investigative research on a variety of critical environmental and human rights issues, including deep-sea mining, IUU fishing and deforestation, and slavery within Brazilian agri-food supply chains. He has a master's degree in international political economy from King's College London and an undergraduate degree in Spanish and Portuguese from the University of Bristol. So Ed, can't think of a better person to introduce the next session than you and contribute to the rest of our webinar this morning. But first of all, the presentation from you, please. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Marlene. Good morning, everyone. I'm Ed. I'm a researcher at IEEP UK. I work across our various research streams, but I'm leading our work on deforestation. This forms part of our wider work on the UK-EU reset, which focuses on opportunities for alignment with EU environmental policy in the wake of this potential resetting of the UK-EU relationship after Brexit. But before I get going, I just want to say what a pleasure it was to hear from Pippa and to have such a fantastic panel here today. And Nicola, Joe and Nora, thank you for joining us. And I'm really looking forward to our panel discussion in due course. So yeah, in this brief presentation, I'll be giving an overview of the UK Forest Risk Commodities, or FRC, regulation. This is secondary legislation which has not yet been introduced in the UK, but was mandated under the Environment Act 2021. and it bans the use of specific commodities which are at a high risk of driving global deforestation and conversion in the UK. I won't be covering the EUDR in any detail in this presentation. I'll be leaving that to my colleague Nora from IEEP AISBL, our sister organisation in Brussels, who is very much the expert on that. Next slide, please, Ben. Perfect, thank you. So before we get going, just a brief roadmap of what I'll cover in this presentation. To start with, we'll take a brief look at what FRCs are and their impact. And then before getting into the legislation itself, I think it's important to begin by looking at a case study that helps us to understand the need for robust regulation that deals with the issue of deforestation within UK commodity supply chains, and helps us also to understand some of the nuances behind the law, and perhaps why the EU's equivalent regulation, the EUDR, which again, Nora will take a closer look at in a second, can both be seen as an inspiration, but maybe also something that may not quite yet go far enough in dealing with the root of the problem. After this, we'll take a look at the potential scope of the UK FRC as outlined by the previous Conservative government. And finally, I'll introduce some ideas, which I'm sure we'll debate further in the panel, as to what the gold standard for effective FRC regulation might look like and where the current scope is falling short. Next slide, please, Ben. Thank you. So to start with, let's be really clear as to what forest risk commodities are and their importance. So forests are, as we all know, incredibly important to our world. They absorb approximately 1/3 of the global CO2 released from the burning of fossil fuels. They're home to 80% of the world's terrestrial biodiversity, and they support the livelihoods of 1.6 billion people. And it's quite simple. Forest risk commodities are those commodities which are driving the majority of global deforestation and conversion, which is in total responsible for between 9 and 14% of global annual GHG emissions. And according to UK government research, there are 7 FRCs which are responsible for 65% of the UK's tropical deforestation risk. These are cattle products, palm oil, soy, maize, coffee, cocoa, and rubber. Next slide, please, Ben. But as I mentioned before we talk about the UK FRC, let's look at a real-world example to contextualise the need for this regulation. So on this slide, we have a photo of the Pantanal. This is the world's largest tropical wetland. It's in Brazil, on the west side of Brazil. And it has both an extremely high biodiversity value and also is of critical importance to the communities that live in and around it. And in this photo, we see it struck by wildfire in 2020. Over 1/3 of the biome burnt that year. That's approximately 39,000 square kilometres, an area larger than Belgium. 17 million wild vertebrates were killed and approximately 116 million tonnes of CO2 was emitted. And while climate change, of course, was a factor in these fires, as we've seen increasingly around the world in recent years, another key factor was the clearing of land for pasture for cattle grazing. And local firefighters reported that in their estimates, 95% of these fires started on private land, and that many of these appeared to have been started intentionally, allegedly as cattle farmers in the region saw a chance to clear land to expand their operations. Next slide, please, Ben. So cattle ranching is now the leading cause of deforestation and native vegetation loss in the Pantanal. The Pantanal is a mix of forest, savanna, grassland and wetland formations. It's a complex biome. The area of pasture more than doubled in the last 20 or so years. It is now occupying an area in the Pantanal more or less equal to the size of North Macedonia. Grassland and wetland formations have been particularly affected. In other words, the effects of this expansion of cattle grazing isn't just hitting forests, it's hitting these other types of vegetation as well. Next slide, please, Ben. So what is causing this growth in cattle ranching? And by consequence, growth in pasture area in the Pantanal? There are 2 key drivers. Firstly, growing international demand for cheap beef. This is the result of various factors, but these include a growing middle class in China, but also consistent demand from the UK and EU. And secondly, deforestation leakage from the neighbouring Amazon and Cerrado biomes. These biomes enjoy increased protections at both the state and federal level in Brazil, perhaps the result of international attention and pressure on these better known areas. Legal deforestation limits are higher in the Pantanal, and as such, it's easier for cattle ranchers to expand their operations there. This is why, as we'll see shortly, it's critical that UK legislation follows the approach of the EUDR in tackling both legal and illegal deforestation in commodity supply chains, something that Pippa alluded to before me. Next slide, please, Ben. So let's now turn to an overview of the UK FRC legislation. So, as mentioned, Schedule 17 of the Environment Act 2021 sets out a framework for tackling deforestation in supply chains. it seeks to prohibit the use of forest risk commodities and derivatives in the UK that have been produced in a manner that does not comply with local land use laws. That is to say, it prohibits commodities that have illegal but not legal deforestation in their supply chains. However, additional secondary UK FRC legislation is required to be passed to operationalise these requirements and determine the scope, due diligence requirements and implementation timeline. It's now been 4 years since the passing of the Environment Act and no bill has yet been introduced. Next slide, please, Ben. And this delay is not without consequences. According to research from Global Witness, which Pippa has already mentioned, UK imports of FRCs last year continued to contribute greatly to global deforestation, taking out forest areas the size of Liverpool. And as a result, the UK is falling behind on its international commitments on reducing global deforestation, most notably the Glasgow Leaders Declaration that it made at COP26, which of course it led, in which it committed to working collectively to halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation by 2030. And all this is taking place whilst global deforestation continues at pace, with the latest Forest Declaration assessment finding that 8.1 million hectares of forests were lost worldwide in 2024, which is 64% higher than the trajectory that we need globally to halt deforestation by 2030. Next slide, please, Ben. Thank you. So what scope has been set out? The only announcements so far on the provisional scope of FRC were given in December 2023 statements under the previous Conservative government and through subsequent answers to parliamentary questions. And all this followed a government consultation on its scope in 2022. And no announcements have yet, or no major announcements have yet been made by the Labour government on the scope of the regs. And this scope, as widely discussed by NGOs and by industry, has a number of limitations. The first key limitation, which is specified in the text of the Environment Act itself, is that it does not cover legal deforestation. This leaves the door open for a race to the bottom in exporting countries. As we saw in the Pantanal case study, differences in legal protections for forests in different regions or nations can lead to deforestation leakage, and less stringent domestic regulation by exporting countries could be used as a tool to increase trade, to increase exports of these commodities. The second limitation of the 2023 scope is that it will initially be limited to only 4 major commodities. That's soy, cocoa, palm oil, and cattle products, emitting 3 of the key FRCs that we mentioned earlier, coffee, maize, and rubber. As with the legal deforestation approach, this is also at odds with the scope of the EUDR, the European version of the regulation, which includes all of these with the exception of maize, which could be added in future after review. The government consultation in 2022 also suggested that legislative sequencing could take place, which would again postpone the implementation of the regulation for certain commodities and weaken its effectiveness. And finally, again, as Pippa alluded to, the 2023 scope indicated that it would only apply to businesses turning over more than £50 million annually. And this differs not only from the EUDR, but also from the UK timber regulation, which applies to all companies regardless of their size or trade volumes. Next slide, please, Ben. Thanks. So finally, given what I touched on so far, what might effective FRC legislation look like? In our view, it would prohibit the use of FRCs produced on both illegally and legally deforested land, bringing it into line with the EU approach and avoiding a damaging race to the bottom amongst major exporters. It would also include, without legislative sequencing, all 7 of the high-risk FRCs in its scope, thereby tackling 65% of the UK's tropical deforestation risk. It would also apply to businesses of all sizes to avoid leaving a portion of imports unregulated, again bringing this into line with the EUDR, which applies to all operators. It would also look to include other wooded land and other natural ecosystems, which includes savanna, grassland and wetland, recognising that the expansion of agricultural land for the production of these FRCs worldwide threatens not only forests, but also these other types of vegetation, and ensuring that these ecosystems, which are critical to carbon storage and high in biodiversity, such as the Pantanal, are protected from the land conversion caused by FRCs. And finally, it would avoid potential loopholes. I think Nora will touch on this more, such as the no-risk category pushed by some members of the European Parliament, which could provide an incentive for the laundering of these commodities through these countries. And a final thought before I finish and before we move on to Nora's presentation is, what does all this mean for potential alignment with the EUDR? As the EUDR has been delayed and simplified, what might alignment now look like? Can the UK continue to wait for the EU to decide on its scope? Or should it use its post-Brexit freedoms to move ahead and set an example of international best practice in this area? Or is that too much to hope for? That's all from me, and I'm sure we'll address many of these questions in the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed. What a fantastic overview of where we are in the UK and where we could be heading. So, to your points, can the UK actually lead on this agenda? So, we're going to now turn to Nora. Nora joins us from our Brussels office, where Nora Hiller is a senior policy analyst for global challenges and the SDGs. She joined the IEP a few years ago, 2019, and has been a senior policy analyst there in the Global Challenges team. She's been involved in a variety of projects on the SDGs, but also deforestation and sustainable finance, and particularly in relation to the EU taxonomy and science policy interface. She has supported IEP's involvement in the Platform on Sustainable Finance, which is an independent group of the European Commission. And she's very experienced with stakeholder engagement and policy analysis on these relevant topics of agriculture and sustainable and resilient food systems. Nora holds an MSc in Environment and Development from the University of Edinburgh and a BA in International Relations and International Organization from the University of Groningen. Nora, fantastic to have you here with us to provide the presentation on the EUDR now. Over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Malini. I also brought some slides. If I can start. Perfect. So yes, as Ed and Malini mentioned, I'm going to give you a quick overview of both the EU deforestation regulation and also its recent developments, as there have been many changes and ups and downs in the recent months that we can look at together today. Next slide, please. So to start us off, here's an overview of the scope and the application of the EUDR. So in scope, we have 7 commodities: cattle, wood, cocoa, soy, palm oil, coffee, rubber, and some of their derived products, which is more than planned on the UK side at the moment. And to be covered, you need to prove that the product brought on the EU market is deforestation free. You also need to comply with local laws in the country of production and provide a due diligence statement. And the rules are different for larger and smaller companies. The regulation targets both legal and illegal deforestation since 2020. So there's that difference that was already mentioned by the other speakers. There's also a benchmarking system in place to assess which risk category a country falls in, which ultimately determines the level of inspection of the shipments from those countries. And was already mentioned previously as well that the EUDR is not coming out of nowhere, and the EU has had a regulation in place on the entry of timber into the EU for a few decades now, which has paved the way for further expansion to those other commodities. We've also already heard quite a bit on why legislation on deforestation is very important. I'd already mentioned that, yeah, the planet, the globe is way behind its goals of zero deforestation, and we're also in a grave climate and biodiversity crisis. And the EUDR will support preventing further forest loss and forest damage by the EU, as the EU drives up to 16% of global deforestation through its imports. And consequently, there is an element of the EU's responsibility towards the world that we should think about and acknowledge, as we are fueling deforestation worldwide with our consumption, but in a way that's nothing new for Europe, as we've been fueling worldwide exploitation of resources and people for the past centuries, in a way. Next slide, please. So we're probably wondering why the regulation was agreed on in 2023, but companies aren't yet obliged to perform their due diligence. Well, there was a first one-year delay that took place in December last year, And the argument was that companies weren't ready and too many questions remained at that point. Then implementation, like the start or the preparation for implementation, continued the year after, until a few weeks ago, where there was a sudden announcement of a delay of the EUDR by another year. The reason given there was the information system, which clocks all the due diligence statements online. The Commission said that there were struggles there and a fear of too many requests happening at the same time and the system breaking down. In a way, the system should have been ready by the end of last year. There were also live tests that started 9 months ago, and some companies have also since said that there are options for optimization to help with the traffic. So things could have been handled potentially in a way. Then we got another sudden announcement a week or so ago that now the Commission plan to delay has been dropped. So a bit of a back and forth there. And instead, the Commission will reopen the regulation push for certain changes to overcome the IT issues. However, the changes that we see are in some ways going a bit further than simple IT fixes and more also along the lines of the simplification agenda of the EU institutions. Next slide, please, where I'll show some of the changes that are proposed. For instance, a due diligence statement will not be required for downstream operators and traders. They will only need one submission of a due diligence statement at the entry into market for products. And then downstream operators and traders are only required to collect and pass on information. There are also some changes for SME operators, specifically in low-risk countries, that a simple one-off declaration in the information system would then be required instead of regular submissions. The implementation for SMEs is also proposed to be delayed by another 6 months to the end of 2026. And they're also intending to bring a grace period in without fines, so that checks by competent authorities would be relaxed until mid-2026. And this is actually something that was proposed by several groups instead of having to postpone for another year. Now, what could be a little bit problematic with these changes is, I mean, in general, the EUDR has become very political, especially now in this political era of competitiveness, which has taken away a bit from an evidence-based approach to policy making. Some mentioned that IT issues might have been solved through other pathways as well, without necessarily opening the regulation, because that means now having to go into further negotiations with member states and the European Parliament just a few months before entry into application. There has also been some issues with the communication overall, so a bit of a confusing timeline where statements were made. For instance, the delay was proposed or announced on a day where the EU-Indonesia trade agreement was agreed on. Just before, there were also many promises made to the US government about US businesses not having to be burdened. The communication was not as clear and potentially confusing for businesses across the board. Then also something that Ed mentioned on the areas such as the Cerrado and Pantanal. So those are areas of otherwood land and wetlands. The review of expanding the scope to potentially these areas has now been moved to 2030. So they will only be considered in another 5 years, even though they are very important areas to also protect. And in a way, there's also a question of credibility towards trading partners, and that just weeks before the COP in Brazil. Next slide, please. I think this was the slide that I wanted for what I was saying now, but we'll work with that anyways. So, but there's another 3 general observations that I would like to end with. First of all, we seem to be in a general fight against climate and environmental data collection worldwide. So there's been other EU laws currently under attack, which are there for also collecting information on company activities related to climate and their supply chain. And as we all know, good data drives evidence-based decision-making. It reveals our problems and where the drivers are. And without that, activities may stay hidden, and both people and the planet will continue to pay the price for that. There's also an overall problem in the EU where we see how decisions that were already made are now being reversed and watered down without a proper impact assessment and consultations. And then thirdly, it's quite noticeable how politics has become quite sluggish and unmotivated in ways even. And the EUDR seems to be another sacrifice to the comfort of those in power, while we're all steadily reaching and heading towards the Earth's planetary boundaries. So I guess I'll leave you with that, my deforestation-free food for thought, and hand back over to Malini.
Thank you very much, Nora. Excellent presentation. And as you've noted, this is a very politically live issue with just the changes to the EUDR, the modifications having been announced a few days ago. So I would now like to move to the next session of our webinar. Thanks very much to both Ed and Nora for the presentations on the UK FRC and the EUDR. We're now going to move to our 2 discussants. Nicola Brennan from WWF-UK and Joe James from Sainsbury's, for some immediate reflections, please, on what you've heard so far, and to introduce your own general positions on UK alignment with EUDR. Nicola and Joe, thank you very much for joining us today to share your expertise. I'm going to take a few minutes to introduce you both so that attendees are aware of your own background as the context for your reflections on what you've heard so far. Nicola Brennan is from WWF-UK. She has been supporting the transition to deforestation and conversion-free, DCF in short, supply chains for nearly a decade. She currently leads corporate advocacy efforts at WWF as a deforestation and conversion-free supply chain specialist. She works across the international network of WWF and national offices in both consumer and producer countries to address forest risk commodities. Over the past 3 years, Nicola has focused on soy, palm oil, and more recently cocoa, collaborating closely with the UK's leading retailers and leveraging WWF's global expertise to navigate challenges and identify opportunities in producer regions. For a voice from business, we have Joe James from Sainsbury's, who joins us. Joe is the sustainability manager at Sainsbury's, where he is responsible for ensuring that the company's own brand supply chains are deforestation and conversion free by 2025, i.e. this year. He looks at EUDR compliance sustainable sourcing, and investing in landscapes to tackle the root causes of deforestation and to support systemic transformation in producing countries. Prior to joining Sainsbury's, Joe worked on obesity policy in the Department for Health and Social Care and the National Food Strategy, where during this time he developed the recommendation for a sugar and salt tax and policies to tackle food poverty during COVID-19. Joe has also held roles in the Treasury, DWP, and Department for International Trade in the UK government, and was initially an English teacher. So thank you very much, both of you. And I think we'll start, please, with Nicola, and then we'll move to Joe. Nicola, over to you, please.
Great. Hi, everyone, and thank you for having me and hosting this excellent and talk. And lots has already been covered, so I'll try not to repeat. But the recent Tipping Points report which was launched 2 weeks ago, which WWF were involved in. I want to point out that showed that we are absolutely in a very critical time, an increasingly critical time, and a decreasing window of opportunity to act on the deforestation that is impacting all areas of our lives, whether that's immediately in the areas that are affected with immediate, intense weather events and water security issues, other pollution and soil erosion, but that there are no borders to the impacts of that, and they will impact areas even if you shift your sourcing to different areas. The impacts of this deforestation and the loss of the emissions and the loss of that climate mitigation will and is already impacting us globally, and including in price hikes and some of the things I expect Joe will be speaking to in terms of the hits that it's having on our supply chains with disruption to commodities that we rely on every day. But also to point out that Tipping Point report also speaks to a lot of positive tipping points. There's a lot of opportunity that we have at our fingertips, and we know is feasible to enact already to create sustainable supply chains that make us more resilient, increase food security, and absolutely protect the nature that we rely on for so many reasons. There are many other reports coming out at the moment ahead of COP30 in the Amazon, and I think and one of them, some of that we're involved in WWF really speaks to the gaps in systemic disclosure and corporate and financial data, which we've known for a long time is a huge barrier to corporates being able to enable and implement their deforestation free commitments and targets, whilst the UK retailers have shown huge leadership in investing in lots of different actions, advocacy within their supply chain here and on the ground in those sourcing areas. There are limitations to what voluntary action can do within these very complex and dominant supply chains, where you have very dominant actors in certain areas that essentially decide whether or not feasible technology and processes are implemented, or you stop serving chicken and pork on your shelves for the next few years until you can work something else out. And for now, no one's agreeing to do that. So we really need to just be acting on what is already feasible. And I think essentially that regulation, I think we really need to remind ourselves that it's not there to kind of sort everything out. It's never been created as a silver bullet, but it's really there as an enabling tool to increase the legal requirements and basically pressure on supply chains to enable action that we know is feasible, and that data sharing and transparency, so that companies and importantly the financial sector can also then be engaged to invest and shift where we currently see, and there'll also be reports coming out from WWF and others in the next few weeks on the huge amount of finance that is still going into supporting deforestation compared to that's supporting forest protection. So we really need that data and transparency to create those systemic shifts. And I think just to say that it's increasingly important because we're also seeing weakening of voluntary action and impacts on voluntary action, such as the Amazon soil moratorium, which has been hugely successful for the last 20 years and is now under huge pressure to essentially fold. And this is a huge risk because we know that some of the biggest importers to the UK may already be involved in sourcing from new areas of the Amazon for essentially for soy to feed chickens and pork, which is totally unnecessary. There's plenty of available land to use used for production of food, and will have catastrophic impacts on all of us. So that's just to show that we can't rely on voluntary action alone, and we really need some more support from the government to raise the bar that's minimally required. I'll finish there and pass over to Jo.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Nicola. You couldn't have been clearer about the shortcomings and from your position at WWF where you see changes needed. Jo, over to you, please, for your reflections on what you've heard so far.
Thank you, and thank you for the kind introduction. Nicola has said many of my talking points, so this will be brief, which maybe speaks to the kind of like high degree of alignment between the UK retailers and the WWF on this issue. We have a commitment to be deforestation and conversion free across our own brand products by the end of 2025. That was made at COP26, and we are doing our best to deliver that. But we have, and this commitment was made before the EU and UK legislation was passed. But to Nicola's point, we are coming up against the limits of voluntary initiatives and the kind of traceability this can drive through global complex supply chains. And we do see legislation such as the deforestation regulation as really supporting and facilitating the delivery of our commitments, and important to do so. So I think the reason why we care about tackling deforestation and conversion in our supply chains is because it helps to drive supply chain resilience. So I think this is pretty evident in the recent increase in cocoa and coffee prices, but we also see it in soy supply chains where extreme weather events are becoming more and more common, and they're becoming more and more severe, which is impacting yields and therefore the price of products. So if we want to keep food affordable and accessible for UK consumers, we need to ensure supply chains are resilient to the impacts of climate change we are seeing, and stopping deforestation is critical in delivering that. And that's why Sainsbury's and all other retailers care about this work and want to see governments work on legislation. As mentioned, we also go beyond sourcing as well. So I know the focus has very much been on traceability and sourcing, which is important, but I think it's worth to highlight that we do go beyond sourcing as well. So for example, we've invested £3.5 million in something called the Responsible Commodities Facility, which supports loans to farmers on the condition they do not deforest or convert any land. And there's mechanisms like that to tackle the root causes of deforestation that need to sit alongside this work around traceability if we're really going to drive the systematic change we need to see, and ensure that we support producers in production countries, so farmers in those countries, to ensure they don't cut down forests and preserve those natural habitats. And I think it's really great that these efforts were acknowledged by the WWF in their recent soy scorecard, where we were the highest scoring retailer in the UK. So thank you, Nicola and her colleagues, for that. So on the EUDR, I think it's really clear that voluntary measures have been helpful, but UK supply chains only have so much power, and we're starting to see some of their limits. So the UK Soy Manifesto represents about 60% of the soy demand in the UK, but wasn't able to deliver on its ambition to have deforestation and conversion-free soy delivered into the UK by 2025. We've seen that RSPO segregated palm oil now represents 85% of palm oil into the UK, but actually globally we've seen RSPO certification kind of tap out really at about 20% of global palm oil. So we're seeing how these efforts have really have supported change, and there has been a lot of progress on it. But for the kind of system-wide supply chain side, supply chain change that we really need to see to transform supply chains, those efforts are not enough by themselves, which is why we support the objectives of the EU deforestation regulation, and we want the UK and EU regulations to be aligned, both in terms of the scope of their products and also kind of in terms of tackling all kinds of deforestation. Non-alignment would drive unnecessary costs, and the reason is essentially if you have a different law in Northern Ireland to what you have in the UK, we would just have to comply with the highest. We would have to comply with the higher one because we can't segregate the products. So when you get we can't segregate products for the Northern Ireland market. When some toilet paper turns up in a Sainsbury's warehouse, we don't know at that point upon delivery if it's headed for Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales or England. And we need to keep that kind of flexibility really. We don't want to kind of end up in a situation where the product offering in Northern Ireland, the kinds of products that are available in Northern Ireland, differs significantly because they have to have a different supply chain, basically. So we want to make sure that customers in Northern Ireland can continue to have access to all the products we offer and also afford the products we offer. And so it's really important we maintain kind of current ways of operating, don't drive unnecessary supply chain costs that really wouldn't actually help tackle the root cause of deforestation. It would just mean building lots of new warehouses and having lots of kind of more complicated supply chain arrangements. So none of that really achieves the objective. So we think alignment between the UK and EU regulations is critical to avoid those costs. As referenced by Nora, we do have complaints, I suppose, about the process, about how the EUDR is being changed and chopped at the last minute. I don't think that's going to come as a surprise. It helps to know when you're kind of setting up kind of fairly complex traceability IT systems in your business that kind of look at thousands of products that kind of move into your warehouses fairly quickly. Sometimes the products land in our warehouses and have to go out on the same day, for example, that we would like a bit more notice when these changes come along and a bit more certainty. But we do support the objectives of the legislation and what it's trying to do. So I'm going to pause there, but happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thanks a lot, Joe. And there will be many questions coming your way. So we are now going to go into the panel discussion section of this webinar. You'll see that there are a number of questions which have come up in the Q&A. Panelists, you're welcome to respond to them directly in the Q&A. And if I can ask those who are placing questions in the chat to please put them in the Q&A, because we can monitor which are the ones that are being answered. And then we can pick them up in the Q&A section, which will be in about 10 minutes time. So a lot has been said in terms of support for alignment, coherence and consistency with the EUDR, but the EUDR itself is subject to challenge and change now, as we've heard already. So I'm going to start with a question for Nora. Nora, you mentioned the latest developments in the EUDR, i.e. its simplification ostensibly so that IT systems are able to cope. How has that affected the effectiveness of the legislation?
Now, because this is all very fresh, it's for me still unclear how the changes will ultimately affect the effectiveness, also because it isn't in application yet, and we'll only know how effective it is when it's actually there. But yeah, there are some changes to the scope and the obligations which seem more far-reaching than maybe IT issues. For instance, the obligations for SMEs, which has been quite weakened now with just a one-time declaration in the information system. Some have said that that might exclude almost the entire European forestry sector from their obligations and create loopholes in that way. And also there's been the idea that a postal address is enough instead of geolocation, which I'm not sure whether that will be sufficient. And yeah, also around the downstream operators, in a way the EUDR should have been designed to ensure that there is a clear and reliable, traceable supply chain. And now with those changes, it seems that there will be information potentially getting lost in the middle. And yeah, it's also the fact that there seem to have not been, or at least not very publicly shared, proper assessments of how these changes, which in some ways are major exemptions, is gonna affect both the information system and the effectiveness.
Thank you. I realize that this is a very, very complex policy area and very fast moving, and you really haven't had a chance to analyze the changes that have just been announced rather. Nicola, I'm going to come to you next because I know that you're following these extremely closely also from the UK side. Question to you is, do these proposed changes to the EUDR, which has just been announced last week, do they make any potential UK alignment easier or more complicated?
I think because we know the previous, at least what has been proposed before, but definitely hasn't been confirmed by the new government, is weaker and would have been annual due diligence statements. What was covered and what the requirements were in there have not been finalized. So it does mean that there's, if they were going to be, as we would expect, we were expecting them to be not as robust as the requirements of the EUDR. So weakening it in effect may make it easier for those to be aligned. But I would, I think the important thing is that a lot of companies and Ghanaian farmers and producers and companies in these countries, in Indonesia, Malaysia, Paraguay, Brazil, Argentina, all of these important places have already invested in a lot of technology just to cover the basics of transparency, traceability, checks, using satellite data that we already have and often is freely available to put in place to make use of and to put into the most, to then build into most efficient platforms where we can share that data in a way that should be made use of. There is no point suddenly just giving someone this might be okay or a label. There's stranded assets that are from investments that are just a complete waste if we don't make use of them. But most importantly, the whole point of this regulation is to decouple our commercial supply chains from deforestation, unnecessary deforestation that impacts all of our lives. So let's make use of what's been developed. The legal requirements for what companies might be fined on may now be weakened, but I think there's a lot to be done now to really pick out what these simplifications might be. I think there's decisions still to be made. They haven't been made. They've been proposed. I think one of the most concerning ones is related to this simplification on declaration and the points at where we're sourcing. If we are just picking is it a postcode or reducing like what is covered in that farm area, we may be missing out key pieces of information where we can either avoid or incentivize deforestation. And that is the end point. We need to have enough information so that companies can get together, can share information and stop incentivizing and financing the proposals for where that land basically incentivizing more land to be converted. We need to have the right information that stops that. So yes, I believe that the UK regulation, the previous versions have been weakened, but we've always been proposing that they make use of the EUDR. Just because the law itself has up to now only covered legality, it doesn't mean you don't make use of and you enable companies to go beyond that to cover all of their actual physical risks, to provide information that meets the legal requirements. And it's only by having that traceability and transparency that you can actually get to the points of the farms and address those legal and non-legal issues, and social issues that we know very well are tied to a lot of the production of and the supply chains of these commodities, and then also the other commodities. So questions have come up about what other commodities might be covered, and maize being one of them. Maize is there's a lot of interchange between maize and cotton, where we're producing soy in South America, and so it would make sense to look at all of them at once. You're covering the same areas. So by enabling, focusing on these four, I think there's a huge risk in trying to delay and suggestions to expand and try and make the perfect regulation. We need to make use of what we have to act on what we have as soon as possible and not be kicking the can down the road to try and get something that everyone agrees on, because we know there's a lot that's already feasible. So we should be making use of that, and the UK government absolutely should be making use of what companies know is possible, to help them leverage the action that they need to address the risks and improve those trading partner relationships, because it's only by having, again, that traceability and transparency can we then invest in those smallholder farmers and the communities around these areas.
Great, so thank you. So Nicola, there are some key themes which are emerging from what most of you are saying. First of all, what you emphasized, build on the investments which have already been made. Don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. There is a lot we know already. Let's just proceed with feasibility. But we are also getting the impression that the EUDR is the gold standard right now. and that is the benchmark for best practice. But of course, you use the word simplification, others are using the word watering down. There is a risk of it being watered down. So I'm going to come to you, back to you, Nora. What is this process by which the EU could further water down deforestation legislation? And when are we likely to know when and how it will be weakened or watered down, simplified in other people's terms? Over to you.
So because the Commission has now opened the process of it being the text being changed, this is now the proposal from the Commission. So for it to take effect, there will be negotiations with the Council, which are the member states, and the European Parliament to either give their green light or also add other amendments from their side. Yeah, the timeline is sort of the next month. I mean, it would take effect end of this year, and if changes should be brought up in that time frame, then yeah, negotiations need to start right away. And we can sort of already from experience from the last years, we can expect the other institutions to also weigh in and propose their own changes. We saw that last year, where in December there were already attempts made by political groups in the Parliament to water down the regulation. Already mentioned the no risk category that was proposed by the EPP, and in the end, only the delay was voted on. But just from that experience, we can already expect at least attempts to be made. Maybe this will be the final text, but maybe also not. So definitely to look out for that in the next couple of months.
Thank you. I'm now going to turn attention to what we can do in the UK. So let me come back to you, Ed. In the UK, as you noted, we've committed to a certain set of proposals under the deforestation legislation in the Environment Act. How easy would it be for the UK to change these should it wish to align? And what are the mechanisms by which the UK could align with the EUDR or go beyond?
Thanks, Melanie. So, I mean, there will be revisions to the primary legislation required, in the sense that only illegal deforestation is covered under the Environment Act under Schedule 17. So there would be amendments required to expand the scope to include illegal deforestation as well. Also, and I note that someone Alison has brought this up in the Q&A, aligning with the human rights aspect of EUDR as well. That would, in the sense of respecting relevant local laws on human rights, that would also require amendments to primary legislation in the UK. But in terms of the turnover threshold for businesses, aligning with the EUDR on that, and aligning in the commodities and scope, that is all to be determined through the secondary legislation.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, final questions, just sticking with the UK, is coming back to you, Nicola. Why is the UK delaying introduction of UK FRC legislation? And where do you see the opportunities for the UK to confirm plans for its own legislation? For example, could it be announced at COP30 or the King's Speech in 2026? Or would it be tied to a future UK-EU Reset Summit if it looks to align? What's your forecast there?
Thank you. I won't pretend to know exactly what we can get out of this current government, but we have seen that it hasn't been a priority when they've come into force, despite a lot of engagement from other civil society groups. I'm part of NGO coalition, deforestation coalition, with a lot of fantastic organisations. We've all been involved in engaging the government, and also companies, retailers included, in sending yet another letter to the government on why this regulation is needed. And I think one of the main issues has been that this government is focused on is focused on growth, and they're not recognizing that the deforestation and the impacts of deforestation and unmanaged deforestation and all of the many social and economic impacts and linkages to that massively undermine the resilience of our supply chains, the resilience of our food security and production. We've already seen huge price hikes the last 2 years for cocoa, which I think probably has already been mentioned, but it's a really prime example. And we're seeing the same in coffee. And we saw the biggest drought across the whole of South America in the whole 720 years on record. This is a huge sourcing area for many commodities around the globe. And these things are just not being recognized because our government's currently focused on kind of very short-term agenda, and not recognizing that small investments on due diligence that is 100% feasible will massively enable and improve the resilience of supply chains and our businesses, and ability to unlock a lot more for our health and nature. And then I think critically also, because it's also underestimated that in many cases you get push back on due diligence to say this is a burden, and then actually doing all of that traceability and action will really create a lot more work than is needed. And in some cases that is true, because what you have is, in the case of soy in South America, for example, is an estimated maybe only 95% of the current production is actually deforestation free with a 2020 cutoff date. And what we're seeing is a lack of will from certain actors and supply chain actors to siphon off and say, for that 3%, no, we're not sourcing from there anymore. That is what's been achieved in the Amazon, and that's what should be expanded on. So it's not about having unnecessary, inefficient, data collection requirements. It's about blocking and stopping incentivizing deforestation at the point, and having that traceability to do so. And then we can stop incentivizing deforestation and focus on all of the other things we need to be focusing on to improve the food system for our health and our businesses. So really, let's get back to the point of this. Let's use the due diligence to stop incentivizing deforestation, to have full traceability and monitoring on all of those sourcing areas. And then where we have those risks, where there are ongoing deforestation or threats and risks, we invest in the transition that's needed to make that equitable for the farmers and the local communities in that area. It's absolutely feasible. But one thing I wanted to say, we didn't mention earlier, sorry, is that on the EUDR, that's part of the simplification concerns are the fact that there are going to be less requirements for data to be shared to large downstream companies. And ultimately, that's going to undermine the scrutiny and the monitoring, because we know without those big consumer-facing companies being able to get the data, we're not going to be able to put the pressure on the supply chains to act and invest. If it's just left behind closed doors at the port to those companies that aren't consumer-facing, there are huge risks in terms of the amount of transparency that is enabled for enabling companies and civil society to really act on the risks and make sure there aren't ongoing non-compliances being allowed to continue.
Great. Thank you very much, Nicola. And thank you also for making that last point so clear. It's something that Joe, as a large retailer, the consumer-facing company, might have a view on. But I'd now like to move to the Q&A session. So we have the virtual floor, which is open. Thank you to everybody who has been placing your questions in the Q&A. We've got a very knowledgeable set of 4 panelists, and I'm going to start with the first question, which is from Anthony Simmons, and this is about the TFFF, the Tropical Forest Forever Fund. This is a key facility which is being initiated by the COP30 presidency, Brazil. As Anthony notes, this is a welcome introduction, but is there a difference in price, cost, and value of forests? And should $4 per hectare per year so undervalues forests, what should it be in that case? So who would like to have a response to that from the panel? Nicola, view from you?
Sure. Sorry, I might have missed the very last point of that question while I was looking at other questions in the comments, so apologies. But in terms of TFFF, we know that we need more finance into protection of forest. Importantly, we need to make sure that that is done well, so it gets to the people that need it, and in a credible way. So those Indigenous actors, which are made guardians of the forests and local communities, and we need to make sure that's done in an equitable way and that they are involved. And there will be different ways in which that works in different regions and different cultures. And I think it's really important that this comes alongside the due diligence requirements, because we'll have those systemic changes where we can begin to stop financing and incentivizing further deforestation, but we'll need additional finance to support and reinforce those communities and systems in producer countries to protect forests, and also provide legal support as well to make sure that the compliance system is working for them.
Thank you very much for your response there, Nicola. And I wanted to make sure that we had something on the TFFF, because it's very much the topic of the day, as Pippa had also noted. But I'm now going to go to those questions which have received the most upvotes. And we're going to start with David Hadley. David's question is, we have heard that the current UK government has not yet made available a draft implementing regulation to the Environment Act 2021. Can you clarify if there is any activity taking place on this topic, and if so, what the forward-looking legislative framework looks like? Who would like to have a response to this? Please go ahead and take the mic. Ed.
I can come in here. Yes. I mean, there have been no public announcements on this. We know that the UK government has taken an active interest in monitoring the latest developments in the EUDR, and there has been increasing interest over the last year. But yeah, as I said, there have been no public announcements.
Okay, thank you. So Nora, you might want to come in on this one, which is about the UK-EU dialogue. Is there any discussion taking place at the political level between the UK government and the European Union in relation to EUDR, UK FRC that you're aware of?
I feel like Ed might be a better place to answer this. I certainly know that the EU has formal platforms with non-EU countries to facilitate discussions around the EUDR and its implementation. And such questions should arise there. But maybe Ed has further knowledge of
you want to follow up on that? Thank you, Nora. Ed, do you want to follow up?
I don't have much to add on that, I'm afraid. I would say that it's a topic that we hope will be the subject of future UK-EU research summits if they are to take place.
We can ask those questions ourselves. Let's do that. Okay, so now we have a question from Imogen Terry. Do you feel that the EUDR robustly encourages businesses to fund conversion-free supply chains, or do you think there needs to be improvements in this area of the regulation? Joe, why don't you come in on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, there will be premiums for EUDR related material. EUDR will require segregation of material to deliver deforestation material into the EU, whether that's soy or palm oil or cocoa or coffee or timber or rubber. So there will be premiums, and that will fund the infrastructure changes, the new silos that need to be built, the new VATs, or and the kind of IT systems that are set up to kind of provide that traceability along supply chains, I think. And from what we've been told, that's where the money will go. I think if there's a separate question around, will that money flow down to farmers to ensure they are not their incentives there to not convert their land, I think some of it will flow down, but not all of it, because some of it will be swallowed up in the middle with the infrastructure costs I just referred to. Sorry, Imogen. I think so. So will the money be there to kind of fund the transformation supply chains? It will legally have to be there. So yes, the money will be there, and I think that there are premiums already paid to kind of like that demonstrate that the market does cover those premiums and that segregation. RSPO, segregated palm oil, being a really good example of that, where the market is funding premiums to cover that. Will all that money go down to the producer? No, it won't. And so therefore, are additional measures needed to kind of support producers and tackle deforestation and conversion in the production countries, I think we would all agree it sounds like yes, there are additional measures that are needed. And the EUDR doesn't mandate that companies have to kind of fund those, I would say kind of beyond supply chain actions that I'm referring to. So yeah, I hope that helps.
Okay, thanks very much, Joe. That's quite clear. I'm now going to come to a comment and a question made by Hannah Conway. There are millions of smallholder farmers in both UK and EU FRC supply chains. The EUDR has come under criticism for being burdensome for producers and small businesses because requirements and costs get pushed up the supply chain. For example, farmer cooperatives have had to pay for their own data systems, extra staff, training, etc., with the risk being that some farmers who don't have the right funding will get pushed out of supply chains. Hannah mentions the Team Europe Initiative Fund, which is also far too small to meet the scale of the challenge faced by producer countries and their farmers. And a question is this: how can the UK FRC support smallholder farmers in UK supply chains? Can the regulation itself build in provisions such as enforceable and credible living income provisions or levies on UK businesses to fund the transition in producer countries? Who would like to have a go with that question? Who's been doing some thinking on that?
I'm happy to begin with the first comments on this. So I think completely agree, and there's definitely been it's undeniable that there has been a lack of, I think, engagement with producer countries earlier on in the development of the EUDR, which is really important to make sure that they are working together to understand the gaps in the finance, what are the gaps that need to be addressed to make sure this is equitable for those smallholders, and to make sure they can then be included and not excluded from due diligence systems. I think the important thing is to say, though, that the regulation was never required to fix all of these things on its own. What the regulation is there to set the bar so that companies that profit from buying from these smallholders in a very opaque systems where they have no obligations and no requirements to support them, whether that be to be deforestation free or for other very important social and economic criteria to make their production sustainable for them, that's the current system. So the regulation is put there to say, we will fine you on the basis of profiting from buying in an opaque system, including from smallholders, where you're profiting from deforestation and driving deforestation. In addition to that, of course, we don't want to make those, just because they're currently opaque, they shouldn't remain opaque or be divested from. The whole point of the regulation is then to say, right, in order to keep sourcing from these companies and do it in an equitable way, there needs to be additional investments to do so. Companies throughout the supply chain are already doing this through certification or investments in landscapes and other means. The issue is, we know that often that certification is only as good as the local governance. So again, the regulation is there to address where there are governance issues and invest in them. So to make that certification, whether it's voluntary or being used for new legal requirements, effective and supportive of those smallholders. I think we've heard from different voices and different actors. We had certainly heard from this example where smallholders maybe raise concerns of being at risk. I've heard in many different rooms directly from smallholders that they're increasingly at risk, especially with climate change, of remaining in these very, very opaque supply chains. And only by being seen and then having that investment can they keep producing the way they are. So in fact, for cocoa farmers, for example, by having that EUDR requirement and actually making sure that those cooperatives are recognised and seen and exist, can they actually be identified so that the right investments can be made to support the shifts that are needed. Equally, we also have many, like in Papua New Guinea, for instance, most of our palm oil is coming from smallholders, and which is already EUDR compliant. So it's not to pretend that this requirement automatically excludes smallholders, because in many cases there's already processes in place, thanks to the voluntary action that now needs more support to scale up.
Great, thank you. So we've still got quite a few questions to go through, and there's a lot to say, but I would encourage you just short, sharp responses, please, so we can get through as many of them. I'm now going to go to Northern Ireland. There's a very good question by Maggie Fitzherbert about the context for Northern Ireland. She asks, in lieu of any formal communication about the status of companies in Northern Ireland who are in scope of UKTR, what is the most prudent approach they should take to ensure trade can continue after December 2025? Should Northern Ireland importantly assume full EUDR compliance as is necessary as per the applicability of operator requirements unless they hear otherwise? Joe, I wonder if you might be in a good position to respond to that question.
I am not a lawyer. Probably that's the kind of like, so with that caveat, the EU timber regulation currently applies in Northern Ireland, while the UK timber regulation applies in Great Britain. And to bring in the EU deforestation regulation, the EU are going to repeal the EU timber regulation and replace it with the EU deforestation regulation. That's our understanding of of the legislative process. I can be wrong, and I'm very happy to be corrected by Ed or Nora and Nicola if there is expertise. That's our understanding, and therefore we consider, and we are not alone in this. You know, other members of the British Retail Consortium agree that the current default scenario is that the EUDR will apply in Northern Ireland, and so that's why we're gearing up for compliance, because we don't have any EU exposure otherwise. We have suppliers from the EU, of course, but we don't have any stores in the EU. So it's Northern Ireland why we're gearing up for the EU deforestation regulation, because we think it will apply in Northern Ireland. Now, there are kind of broader questions about, will customs officials be skilled, have the legal powers to enforce it at the border? Will they have the legal powers for in-country inspection? Those are beyond our remit. Those are subject to kind of broader delays and UK government discussions that we've referenced before. But the position of Sainsbury's is very much that we expect the EUDR to apply. We want to be compliant with the law. We don't want to break the law. And so that's what we're gearing up to comply with. And we are not an outlier in that position.
Thank you. And of course, there is a related question with regard to wood and wood products. They will remain under the jurisdiction of the UKTR and not the FRC. So does that make it quicker or simpler to roll out the FRC, or the reverse? That's a question from Ali Dunnett. A very quick response to that, please, because we're just 5 minutes away from the end, and I want to bring in one final question about human rights.
We're pushing for alignment. We're pushing for alignment between UK regulation and the EUDR. That's the simplest thing you can do.
Great. That seems to be the theme of the session. Okay, so the final question is this from Alison Hoare. One of the biggest omissions from the UK's FRC is the lack of any reference to human rights. In quotation marks, relevant local laws are defined as those that relate to land ownership, inter alia, but there's no reference to human rights, whereas the EUDR does require compliance with some human rights laws. I would ask the panel to reply to this, please. Would you agree with this being a priority for increasing the scope of the UK's approach? Very quick responses on that, please, as we come to the close.
Yes,
Ed,
I'm happy to start. Yes, I mean, a very easy answer. Yes, absolutely. I think it's essential that we align with the EUDR on this aspect and revise the primary legislation as such. It's the fact that we're in 2025 and we're still importing commodities with slavery in the supply chain into the UK and EU is shocking, and action needs to be taken immediately.
Thank you, Ed. Any objections to that? Any other views? Or is everyone in agreement?
No objections. I'd just say I think it's important. We want the UK regulation to come out as soon as possible, but we absolutely shouldn't be waiting until it's all finalised, and we should be acting on available information already, because these human rights abuses need to be tackled immediately. And as we've said before, there's lots of traceability and transparency and monitoring that is already available to make use of. And then just to add that it can be very complicated in addressing some of these issues where land tenure is not formalized, and that needs to be recognized too, so that the human rights actually address human rights and not just what human rights are maybe recognized and formalized by those local governments or indeed by our governments at the time. We need to make sure it actually addresses the full range of everyone involved, and there's many other environmental and human rights organizations who have expertise in the different sourcing areas to bring data to this.
Thank you very much. Now, we have 2 minutes, so that's about 30 seconds for each panelist for their closing key message, please, to leave this webinar with. Let me come back to Nora for that, please. Nora, very quick and punchy, your final key message.
Okay, so I would really hope to see the negotiations not go further than for the EUDR, not to go further than what is proposed now by the Commission, but we will probably see some room in the negotiations which will turn other ways, and I would encourage civil society to be vigilant and follow the procedures and to be aware and to fight together.
Fantastic. Thank you. Joe, you up next, please.
We kind of support alignment between the UK and EU regulations, and I think it's really important to not just focus on the administrative burden, but actually the resilience that this traceability can unlock and how it can improve people's lives along the supply chain, particularly farmers in production countries. Thank you.
And Nicola, final word, anything that remains unsaid?
Just that we need to use this regulation and be very loud about it, so that our government, at the very least, are making those very important decisions at COP that they can then be announcing at the King's Speech in the new year.
Great, thank you very much. And finally, Ed, lots for us at IEP to chew on and to work on. What are the key things to start with?
A lot to chew on. I mean, I would just reiterate, this is such a fantastic opportunity for UK-EU alignment. It's already been 4 years. We're already falling behind our international commitments. The time is now to act. And it's alignment and working bilaterally with the EU in future to expand the scope to fully tackle the whole scope of this issue is just essential. And that's my closer.
Okay, fantastic. So we have our work cut out. Thank you so much to all of our panelists, to Pippa, who joined us at the beginning of the webinar, to all those of you who have joined us and contributed your thoughts and questions in the chat and the Q&A. This will be placed as a recording on our IEP website for those of you who want to come back to it. But for now, thank you very much for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day. And please stay in touch. Thank you very much to everyone. Bye for now.